When the iron bell rang in Dry Gulch, it didn't sound like church. It sounded like warning, like the town itself had cleared its throat before doing something it would later pretend not to remember. Dust hung in the air that afternoon, fine as flour and just as eager to get into your mouth. The sun sat low enough to throw long shadows off the hitching rails and boardwalks, and somewhere up high a hawk circled like it had business with nobody but hunger. Behind the livery, a mule brayed like it was arguing with God. Men gathered in a loose half-moon around a plank platform in front of Weatherby & Co. Mercantile, hats tipped low, boots planted wide, hands resting near belts, the way hands do when they want to look harmless but aren't. I was perched on an upturned crate beside the water trough, 13 years old, all elbows and curiosity, with ink stains on my fingers from running notices for the paper. In a town like ours, you learned early that keeping your eyes open mattered more than keeping your mouth shut. From my spot, I could see everything. The platform, the crowd, and the row of women standing stiff as fence posts. 10 of them, brought in like freight, lined up like the town was picking out tools. Their dresses were travel-wrinkled, their hands clutched carpet bags and shawls, and every one of them wore the same careful face, the face you put on when you're standing on ground that might shift under you. One had cheap beads, one held a Bible with a broken clasp. None of them looked like they belonged to Dry Gulch. They looked like they belonged to somewhere with curtains and doorknobs that didn't stick. Then there was Weatherby. Clean waistcoat, polished boots, smile sharp enough to cut rope. He lifted his hands like he was conducting music instead of selling lives. "Gentlemen," he called, "Dry Gulch is prospering. A man without a wife is like a stove without a match, cold and useless." Folks laughed because it was easy. Weatherby talked about honorable courtship and fair arrangements, like paper could make a thing honorable just by being signed. But I watched the men more than I watched the women, because I'd seen what happens when a man's eyes decide a person is a possession. They stepped forward fast, handshakes, quick glances, coins changing hands near Weatherby's pocket. 2 women were led away before the dust had even time to settle. The rest followed in a rhythm that felt like cards being dealt, swift, practiced, thoughtless. One by one, those carpet bags disappeared into the crowd. Forced smiles, men guiding elbows, boots scraping, the town making little satisfied noises like it had just done something sensible. And then, the line thinned down to 1. Cordelia Murphy stood at the far end, as if someone had placed her there to complete the picture and then forgotten her. She was older than the others, late 20s, and broader through the hips and shoulders. Not grotesque, not ridiculous, just solid. The kind of body that looked like it had carried weight long before it ever carried extra flesh. Her hair was pinned back tight, not for beauty, but for survival. Dust had settled on her shoulders like a second shawl. Her hands were rough, nails trimmed, fingers marked with small cuts, working hands, the kind of hands you'd trust with a hot pot and a crying child. Behind me, I heard it start, the muttering. Leftovers. That one lead a winter's stores. Too much woman for any saddle. Somebody laughed like a dog. Cordelia kept her eyes down on the boards, staring like she could sink through them and vanish. Weatherby clapped his hands and turned his grin toward her like a knife turned to meat. "Well now," he announced, "seems we have one fine lady remaining, a sturdy sort. Any takers?" A drunk miner hollered something ugly. Another voice added a joke that wasn't funny unless you'd forgotten how to be human. The town's laughter rolled around her like smoke. I saw Cordelia's shoulders tighten. I saw her bite her lip hard enough that her mouth went pale. Then the hoofs came. Not the light tapping of a cowpony. These were slow, heavy strikes on stone, measured, deliberate, like somebody walking straight into trouble and not blinking. Heads turned. The laughter died off like a candle dies when someone cups it. The air felt thinner. A horse the color of wet stone emerged from the glare at the end of the street, taller and broader than anything our town usually saw. Scar down one flank, like it had survived a fight it didn't start. And on that horse sat Jeremiah Stone. Most folks in Dry Gulch spoke his name like a superstition. Thunder Peak, they called him. Some said he'd killed a bear with his bare hands. Some said he buried his wife and child up on the mountain and hadn't spoken right since. I'd only seen him once before, from far off in winter, dragging a sled of furs while the rest of us stayed indoors pretending we didn't fear the cold. Up close, he looked like the mountain had cut a piece of itself loose and taught it to ride. Big shoulders, storm gray eyes, beard touched with iron. Not loud, not showy, just present, like gravity in a coat. He swung down from the saddle without hurry, boots hitting stone with a solid final sound. Weatherby started to greet him, all brightness, but Jeremiah didn't bother answering. He looked up at the platform, took in the empty spaces where the other women had been, and his gaze stopped on Cordelia as if it had found the only thing in the town worth noticing. "I'll take her," he said. The square went quiet. Even the saloon door hung half open like it was listening. Weatherby blinked, smile tightening. "Mr. Stone, surely you mean there were younger choices, delicate ladies." Jeremiah's eyes shifted slowly to Weatherby, and I swear it felt like a rifle being leveled. "I said," Jeremiah repeated, voice low and steady, carrying across the square like distant thunder, "I'll take the fat one." That word, fat, should have landed like another stone thrown at her. That's what we expected. That's what the town was ready to enjoy. But the way Jeremiah said it wasn't a joke. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't even excitement. It was plain fact, like he was pointing to the only horse that could pull a winter load and saying, "That one." Cordelia lifted her head just a little, like she wasn't sure she'd heard right. Her eyes were bright with shock and something else that looked dangerous. Hope, maybe, or the first spark of anger that wasn't aimed inward. Weatherby cleared his throat. "The fee for this arrangement is—" Jeremiah reached into his coat and dropped the leather pouch onto the boards. It hit with a heavy final thud. The mouth of it gapped just enough for gold to flash, real gold, bright in the dusty light. Weatherby's eyes changed immediately. Greed smoothed out his surprise like a palm smoothing wrinkled paper. "That's more than—" Weatherby began. "Enough," Jeremiah said, cutting him off like he was chopping wood. Then Jeremiah turned back to Cordelia and held out his hand. Big palm, calloused, steady. Not a grasp, not a demand, an offer. Cordelia stared at it like it was a bridge over a gorge, wanting it, terrified of what the crossing meant. Her fingers trembled. She swallowed. And then, slowly, as if she decided she was done living for other people's amusement, she placed her hand in his. Jeremiah's fingers closed around hers. Not crushing, not delicate, just sure. The kind of grip that says, "I'm not letting go," and means it. He led her down off the platform, and the crowd made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh anymore. Men muttered. Somebody tried to snort and couldn't find the humor. The town didn't know what to do with the sight of Jeremiah Stone choosing what they'd rejected. Some recoiled like his choice was contagious. Others watched like they were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. And out past the last boardwalk and the last joke, the mountain waited, quiet as ever, like it had been listening the whole time. They left Dry Gulch before sundown, when the light turns the dusk gold, and every shadow looks like it's hiding something. Jeremiah Stone didn't make a show of it. No final glance back, no speech, no warning to the men still lingering in the square. He climbed onto the wagon bench like he'd done it 1,000 times, gathered the reins in his big hands, and set the team to moving as if the whole town behind him was nothing but weather. Cordelia sat beside him, stiff at first, like she was afraid the boards might judge her the way people had. She kept her carpet bag between her boots, hands wrapped around the straps so tight her knuckles looked pale beneath the dust. The wagon was plain and solid, more workhorse than parade float, its wood worn smooth where hands had hauled and pushed. 2 heavy draft horses leaned into the harness with patient strength, hooves chewing the rutted road in a steady rhythm. I followed for a while, the way a boy follows a story he doesn't understand yet. Not close enough for them to turn and catch me, not far enough to pretend I didn't care. I kept to the side of the road, stepping around rocks and clumps of sage, my heart thumping like it was trying to match the wagon's creak. Maybe I told myself I was just curious, but the truth is, Dry Gulch had a way of swallowing people and spitting out jokes. And when I saw Cordelia take Jeremiah's hand, I felt something shift, like the town's cruelty had finally met something heavier than itself. The wagon rolled past the last fence and the last half-sleeping dog, past the outlying sheds and the lonely ranch gate, and into open country. The town sounds faded behind them. No more laughter, no more clink of bottles, no more loud confidence. Just wind and wheels and the long, indifferent silence of the west. I watched until the wagon became a small shape in big land. Then I stopped. Because there's a point where a boy's courage runs out and the world gets too wide. I turned back toward Dry Gulch with dust in my mouth and a strange ache in my chest, like I'd missed something I hadn't even understood. Cordelia didn't look back. The flats gave way to rougher ground. The soil grew stingy, sage thinning into scrub and stone. The sky felt bigger out there, as if it had been waiting all along for them to leave town and step into honesty. Wind slid across the open land with no apology. By late afternoon, the air cooled fast, and shadows stretched long enough to trip a man if he wasn't paying attention. Jeremiah drove without wasting words. He didn't chatter to fill the space, and he didn't force Cordelia to carry the weight of conversation. The silence between them wasn't friendly yet, but it also wasn't cruel. It was cautious, like two strangers sharing a fire in a place where fires don't last unless you tend them. When the sun started sinking toward the horizon, Jeremiah pulled the wagon to a stop near a shallow creek. Reeds leaned into the breeze. The water ran clear and cold over stones that looked older than any town. He jumped down, boots sinking into damp soil, and went to work building a fire with the quick, practiced motions of someone who'd made a living out of being ready. Cordelia climbed down carefully, gathering her skirt so it wouldn't catch on brush. He hesitated, like she wasn't sure what she was allowed to do, then knelt to gather small sticks. Her hands moved with a kind of competence that doesn't need applause. She wasn't delicate. She wasn't helpless. She was tired, yes, but tired in the way a person gets tired after doing too much for too long, not tired in the way people like to imagine when they're looking for weakness. Jeremiah cooked simple food: jerky, hard bread, beans warmed in a blackened pot. No ceremony, just survival. When the coffee was ready, he set a tin cup beside her without looking at her like he expected thanks. Cordelia stared at it, wary. Back in town, I'd heard men call women like her greedy, like hunger was a sin that only showed up on certain bodies. But Jeremiah's offering didn't have a hook in it. It was just a cup of coffee in a coldening world. She took it slowly, fingers wrapping around the warm metal. The steam rose into the dusk like a small blessing no one had bothered to name. Night fell hard out there, not like town night with lanterns and windows and noise. Out there, darkness wasn't a curtain. It was a landscape all its own. Coyotes laughed somewhere far off, and the sound carried in a way that made it feel close. The fire snapped and hissed. The horses shifted in their tethers, breath puffing white in the cool air. Cordelia lay in a bedroll near the fire, with a blanket pulled tight. Jeremiah didn't lie down. He sat with his back against a log, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the tree line as if trouble expected to step forward and introduce itself. Cordelia tried to sleep. Her body needed it, but the dark was different out there, wide, patient, and full of things you couldn't see but could still feel. Sometime after midnight, something moved beyond the firelight. A soft crunch, a pause, then another crunch, careful and slow. Cordelia's breath caught. She didn't call out. She didn't sit up. She simply froze, the way prey freezes when it realizes it has been noticed. Jeremiah spoke without turning his head. Just two words, low and steady. Just stay still. And Cordelia stayed still, because she didn't have any reason yet to not trust him. The sound came again, something shifting between trunks just beyond what the flames could reach. For one heartbeat, the fire popped and flared brighter, and the shadows jumped. Cordelia thought she saw a shape, tall, wrong in the way it moved. Then it was gone, swallowed by darkness like it had never been there at all. Jeremiah didn't chase. He didn't shout. He watched. And that was somehow worse and better at the same time, because it meant he understood the land well enough not to insult it by pretending he controlled it. Eventually, the night went quiet again, but the quiet didn't feel safe. It felt like a pause between teeth. Near dawn, when the fire burned lower and the cold pressed in, Jeremiah finally spoke, like he was commenting on the weather. "Mountain got eyes," he said. "Best you don't stare back." Cordelia didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said she'd heard him. Morning came pale and cold, mist hanging over the creek. Jeremiah poured coffee like the night hadn't happened, like fear was something you handled the way you handled firewood, useful when it kept you alive, useless when it started running your choices. They traveled again, climbing into higher country. The trail narrowed, sage giving way to pine. Snow still clung in shaded hollows even though it was meant to be spring. The air thinned and every breath felt like it had to be earned. By the third day, the wagon could go no further. Jeremiah stopped where the path tightened into rock and root, then unloaded with efficient strength. Packs, tools, food. He fitted a pack saddle, cinched straps with practiced hands, and brought a calm mare forward. Cordelia looked up at the slope ahead and swallowed. It didn't look like a road anymore. It looked like a test. Jeremiah checked the saddle cinch twice. Not for show, not to prove anything. Just careful, as if the details mattered more than pride. Then he steadied the mare while Cordelia mounted. She expected a joke, a comment, anything about her weight. Jeremiah gave her none of that. He only adjusted the stirrup so her foot sat right and made sure she was balanced. Then they started upward. Cordelia rode while Jeremiah walked, carrying more than seemed possible without making it into a performance. His boots slid on loose stone sometimes, but he caught himself and kept going. He didn't complain. He didn't encourage her with soft words. He simply stayed near, steady as the mountain he came from. After a long stretch of climbing, Cordelia found a question in herself sharp enough to push past her fear. "Why me?" she asked, her voice tight from thin air. Jeremiah didn't answer right away. His stride didn't change. He climbed as if the question was part of the trail, something to step over carefully. Finally, he said, "Because you look like you know what it is to keep going when it would be easier to not." Cordelia swallowed hard. "Is that all a husband needs?" she asked. "Someone who can keep going?" Jeremiah looked up at her then, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the climb. "It's what I need," he said. And they kept climbing, two figures moving into the pines, into colder air, into a country where the land didn't flatter anyone. But for the first time since she stepped on that platform in Dry Gulch, Cordelia didn't look like a woman being carried somewhere against her will. She looked like a woman being brought somewhere on purpose. They left Dry Gulch before sundown, when the light turns the dusk gold and every shadow looks like it's hiding something. Jeremiah Stone didn't make a show of it. No final glance back, no speech, no warning to the men still lingering in the square. He climbed onto the wagon bench like he'd done it 1,000 times, gathered the reins in his big hands, and set the team to moving as if the whole town behind them was nothing but weather. Cordelia sat beside him, stiff at first, like she was afraid the boards might judge her the way people had. She kept her carpet bag tucked between her boots, hands wrapped around the straps so tight her knuckles looked pale beneath the dust. The wagon was plain and solid, more workhorse than parade float, its wood worn smooth where hands had hauled and pushed. Two heavy draft horses leaned into the harness with patient strength, hooves chewing the rutted road in a steady rhythm. I followed for a while, the way a boy follows a story he doesn't understand yet. Not close enough for them to turn and catch me, not far enough to pretend I didn't care. I kept to the side of the road, stepping around rocks and clumps of sage, my heart thumping like it was trying to match the wagon's creak. Maybe I told myself I was just curious. But the truth is, Dry Gulch had a way of swallowing people and spitting out jokes. And when I saw Cordelia take Jeremiah's hand, I felt something shift, like the town's cruelty had finally met something heavier than itself. The wagon rolled past the last fence and the last half-sleeping dog, past the outlying sheds and the lonely ranch gate, and into open country. The town sounds faded behind them. No more laughter, no more clink of bottles, no more loud confidence. Just wind and wheels and the long, indifferent silence of the West. I watched until the wagon became a small shape in big land. Then I stopped, because there's a point where a boy's courage runs out, and the world gets too wide. I turned back toward Dry Gulch with dust in my mouth, and a strange ache in my chest, like I'd missed something I hadn't even understood. Cordelia didn't look back. The flats gave way to rougher ground. The soil grew stingy, sage thinning into scrub and stone. The sky felt bigger out there, as if it had been waiting all along for them to leave town and step into honesty. Wind slid across the open land with no apology. By late afternoon, the air cooled fast and shadows stretched long enough to trip a man if he wasn't paying attention. Jeremiah drove without wasting words. He didn't chatter to fill the space, and he didn't force Cordelia to carry the weight of conversation. The silence between them wasn't friendly yet, but it also wasn't cruel. It was cautious, like two strangers sharing a fire in a place where fires don't last unless you tend them. When the sun started sinking toward the horizon, Jeremiah pulled the wagon to a stop near a shallow creek. Reeds leaned into the breeze. The water ran clear and cold over stones that looked older than any town. He jumped down, boots sinking into damp soil, and went to work building a fire with the quick, practiced motions of someone who'd made a living out of being ready. Cordelia climbed down carefully, gathering her skirt so it wouldn't catch on brush. She hesitated like she wasn't sure what she was allowed to do, then knelt to gather small sticks. Her hands moved with a kind of competence that doesn't need applause. She wasn't delicate. She wasn't helpless. She was tired, yes, but tired in the way a person gets tired after doing too much for too long, not tired in the way people like to imagine when they're looking for weakness. Jeremiah cooked simple food, jerky, hard bread, beans warmed in a blackened pot. No ceremony, just survival. When the coffee was ready, he set a tin cup beside her without looking at her like he expected thanks. Cordelia stared at it, wary. Back in town, I'd heard men call women like her greedy, like hunger was a sin that only showed up on certain bodies. But Jeremiah's offering didn't have a hook in it. It was just a cup of coffee in a coldening world. She took it slowly, fingers wrapping around the warm metal. The steam rose into the dusk like a small blessing no one had bothered to name. Night fell hard out there, not like town night with lanterns and windows and noise. Out there, darkness wasn't a curtain, it was a landscape all its own. Coyotes laughed somewhere far off, and the sound carried in a way that made it feel close. The fire snapped and hissed, the horses shifted in their tethers, breath puffing white in the cool air. Cordelia lay in a bedroll near the fire, with a blanket pulled tight. Jeremiah didn't lie down. He sat with his back against a log, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the tree line as if trouble expected to step forward and introduce itself. Cordelia tried to sleep. Her body needed it, but the dark was different out there, wide, patient, and full of things you couldn't see but could still feel. Sometime after midnight, something moved beyond the firelight. A soft crunch, a pause, then another crunch, careful and slow. Cordelia's breath caught. She didn't call out. She didn't sit up. She simply froze, like prey freezes when it realizes it has been noticed. Jeremiah spoke without turning his head. Just 2 words, low and steady. Just stay still. And Cordelia stayed still, because she didn't have any reason yet to not trust him. The sound came again, something shifting between trunks just beyond what the flames could reach. For one heartbeat, the fire popped and flared brighter, and the shadows jumped. Cordelia thought she saw a shape, tall, wrong in the way it moved. Then it was gone, swallowed by darkness like it had never been there at all. Jeremiah didn't chase, he didn't shout, he watched, and that was somehow worse and better at the same time, because it meant he understood the land well enough to not insult it by pretending he controlled it. Eventually, the night went quiet again, but the quiet didn't feel safe. It felt like a pause between teeth. Near dawn, when the fire burned lower and the cold pressed in, Jeremiah finally spoke like he was commenting on the weather. "The mountain got eyes," he said. "Best you don't stare back." Cordelia didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said she'd heard him. Morning came pale and cold, mist hanging over the creek. Jeremiah poured coffee like the night hadn't happened, like fear was something you handled the way you handled firewood, useful when it kept you alive, useless when it started running your choices. They traveled again, climbing into higher country. The trail narrowed, sage giving way to pine. Snow still clung in shaded hollows even though it was meant to be spring. The air thinned, and every breath felt like it had to be earned. By the 3rd day, the wagon could go no further. Jeremiah stopped where the path tightened into rock and root, then unloaded with efficient strength, packs, tools, food. He fitted a pack saddle, cinched straps with practiced hands, and brought a calm mare forward. Cordelia looked up at the slope ahead and swallowed. It didn't look like a road anymore. It looked like a test. Jeremiah checked the saddle cinch twice, not for show, not to prove anything, just careful, as if the details mattered more than pride. Then he adjusted the stirrups so her foot sat right and made sure she was balanced. Then they started upward. Cordelia rode while Jeremiah walked, carrying more than seemed possible without making it into a performance. His boots slid on loose stones sometimes, but he caught himself and kept going. He didn't complain, he didn't encourage her with soft words, he simply stayed near, steady as the mountain he came from. After a long stretch of climbing, Cordelia found the question in herself sharp enough to push past her fear. "Why me?" she asked, voice tight from thin air. Jeremiah didn't answer right away. His stride didn't change. He climbed as if the question was part of the trail, something to step over carefully. Finally, he said, "Because you look like you know what it is to keep going when it would be easier not to." Cordelia swallowed hard. "Is that all a husband needs?" she asked. "Someone who can keep going?" Jeremiah looked up at her then, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the climb. "It's what I need," he said. And they kept climbing. 2 figures moving into the pines, into colder air, into a country where the land didn't flatter anyone. But for the first time since she stepped on that platform in Dry Gulch, Cordelia didn't look like a woman being carried somewhere against her will. She looked like a woman being brought somewhere on purpose. For nearly 2 weeks after Jeremiah Stone rode out of Dry Gulch with Cordelia Murphy, I didn't see him, not on the street, not at the trough, not even as a shadow passing the saloon windows. But I saw the aftermath of him everywhere, like a boot print you can't scrape out of dust. It showed up in the way men stopped laughing when someone said Thunder Peak. It showed up in the way Weatherby started wearing his pistol on the outside of his coat, as if a little metal could make him brave. and it showed up in the new notice nailed to the post outside the telegraph office. Fresh paper on old wood, ink still dark and hungry. I ended up reading it out loud because folks in Dry Gulch have a funny habit. When reading might make them responsible, they suddenly forget how. The notice wasn't written like a message. It was written like a trap. It talked about breach of contract, binding agreements, and harboring Cordelia Murphy as if she were stolen property instead of a woman with legs and a will. It warned that anyone helping her could be punished, like paper could stretch all the way up a mountain and put a hand around somebody's throat. Old Mr. Spence from the print shop leaned in over my shoulder while I read, smelling like ink and worry. He muttered, "That's what they do when they're angry. They turn paper into rope." I didn't know then how true that was. Not long after, I saw Weatherby crossing the street with two men behind him. One was a deputy with a star that shone too bright for Dry Gulch, like it hadn't done enough work yet to dull down into honesty. The other was a stranger, tall coat, flat brim hat, the kind of man who carries himself like he's already been paid. The stranger stopped at the notice and read it once. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like the look a man gets when someone just handed him directions. That night I did what boys do when they're scared and don't want to admit it. I listened. I drifted around behind the saloon to the side wall where the boards don't quite meet. If you press your ear close and hold your breath, you can catch enough words to feel the danger coming. Weatherby's voice slid out first, smooth, pleased with itself. He said it wasn't about the girl, not really. He said it was about precedent. If folks started thinking they could walk away from a contract, his whole little business would fall apart. The deputy's voice answered, lazy and mean, something about precedent not paying losses. Weatherby laughed softly. He talked about the mountain man like he was a problem to be solved. He said Stone had land no one registered, timber, water, furs, things that could be turned into money if you got the law to point the right way. Then the stranger spoke. His voice was dry as bone. He said one word that made the whole room go quiet in my mind. Silver. Just hearing it through the wall made my stomach turn cold, because silver doesn't just buy tools and whiskey. Silver buys men. It buys courage. It buys lies that sound like truth when enough people repeat them. Weatherby didn't deny it. He talked like rumors were a kind of map. And the stranger, Rusk they called him, talked like a man who follows maps for a living. He said the woman was leverage, the contract was leverage, and the law was a club you could swing without dirtying your hands. That was when I pulled away from the wall. My cheek caught a splinter and it stung, but I barely felt it. All I could think was, they were going up the mountain and they were bringing paper and guns and excuses. I went home and tried to sleep. I honestly did. But the ceiling looked too close, and my thoughts were too loud. Near midnight, I slipped out with my boots in my hands, and a satchel stuffed with bread, jerky, and 2 apples I definitely didn't been given permission to take. I didn't tell my mother because she would have locked me in the cellar, and because sometimes you just know you're already in too deep to ask. I took the lower trail toward Thunder Peak, the one that trappers use, the one that climbs crooked through scrub and stone. The sky was full of stars, sharp enough to cut. The wind smelled like sage at first, then like pine, then like old snow. I kept thinking of something a trapper once told me. Don't walk straight if you think you're being watched, and don't whistle in the pines, because the mountain might answer. So I didn't whistle. I barely breathed. By the time dawn began to gray the world, my legs were shaking, and my throat felt raw. But then I saw it. A thin curl of smoke rising steady above the trees. A chimney. A home. It looked peaceful from a distance, which almost made it worse, because peace doesn't last when men decide it's in their way. I approached the cabin like a mouse approaches a hawk's nest, quiet, cautious, ready to bolt. Cordelia stepped onto the porch with a bucket in her hands. She wore a man's wool overshirt over her dress, and her hair was pinned back practical. She didn't look like the fat one standing on a platform anymore. She looked like a woman who belonged to her own body. When she saw me, she startled hard enough that water sloshed over the rim. Her eyes narrowed immediately, like she was deciding whether I was danger or just foolish. "Boy," she said, "how did you—" The door opened behind her, and Jeremiah Stone filled it like a storm front. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he just looked at me with those gray eyes that seemed to measure weight and truth. "Why are you here?" he asked.
My mouth dried, but I forced the words out. "They're coming," I said. "Weatherby, a deputy, and a man named Rusk. They've got papers, and they're talking about silver." Jeremiah didn't move, but something in his jaw tightened slow, like a millstone turning. Cordelia set the bucket down carefully, as if she didn't trust her own hands. "Papers?" she repeated, like the word tasted wrong. "What papers?" I told them what I'd seen. The notice on the post, the talk in the saloon, the way they said her name like it was a tool to pick a lock, the way they used the word leverage like it was something you could keep in your pocket. Cordelia's face went pale, then flushed. She said, "They can't own me," but I heard the old fear underneath, the fear of being treated like baggage, like a clerical error, like something you could buy, lose, and replace. Jeremiah's voice came quiet but firm. "Paper doesn't own you," he said, "but men with paper try." He looked past me toward the trees, like he expected to see riders between them already. Inside, he told me to eat. I did because my hands wouldn't stop shaking until I had something warm in me. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. The fire was steady. The place felt built to endure, and that made what was coming feel even uglier. Cordelia stood at the table, bracing her hands on the wood. "I came willingly," she said, voice stronger now. "I chose to take his hand." Jeremiah met her eyes. "I know," he said, and for a moment the room felt like it could hold. Then she asked the question that had been hanging in the air since I said the word silver. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is that what they want?" Jeremiah didn't answer with a speech. He didn't deny it. He just moved to the mantel, lifted a board like it was a habit, and pulled out an oilcloth bundle. He unrolled it on the table, a hand-drawn map, ridgelines, a creek, a mark, bold and dark, like an X you'd put over a buried secret. Cordelia stared at it, then looked up at him. "They'll come anyway," she said. Jeremiah nodded once. "So we decide where we stand." Right then, something faint drifted in through the cabin's walls. Maybe wind, maybe nothing, maybe the mountain reminding us it was listening. Cordelia's eyes flicked toward the window. My skin prickled. Jeremiah didn't flinch. He simply pointed toward the door and told me, in that voice that doesn't invite argument, that I'd go back down. I'd tell no one. I'd say I saw nothing. I nodded because I was a boy and he was a mountain, and because I suddenly understood what I'd done. I hadn't just carried news uphill, I'd carried war. When I stepped off the porch, the morning air felt too clean. The pines stood quiet. Smoke rose steady from the cabin like the cabin was trying to pretend it was just another day. But the way Jeremiah stood in the doorway, still as stone, eyes on the tree line, told me the truth. Trouble was already climbing, and up on Thunder Peak, Paper Law was about to find out what happens when it meets a man who doesn't bend.
Caleb Dunn went back down the mountain after breakfast, just like Jeremiah Stone told him to. He disappeared into the trees until the pines swallowed him whole. Cordelia watched the last flicker of his movement, and only then let out the breath she'd been holding since he arrived without warning on his tongue. When she turned back toward the cabin, Jeremiah was already at the workbench, laying things out the way a man lays out tools before a hard job. Rifle, revolver, a battered shotgun with an old repair along the stock, a hatchet, rope, nails, a heavy hammer that looked like it had ended more than one argument without needing a second swing. Cordelia stood in the doorway a moment, listening to the quiet clink of metal and the low pop of the hearth. "You were waiting for this," she said. Jeremiah didn't bother pretending otherwise. "Always," he replied. There was something in that word, always, that made the cabin feel colder, even with the fire burning. Cordelia stared at the weapons, at the careful order of them, and her mind tried to slip backward into fear, into being a thing again, into being someone carried by other people's choices. She didn't let it. "Teach me," she said. Jeremiah finally looked up. His eyes didn't soften, but they did something else. Measured her, not like a man judging her body, but like a man judging whether she'd stand when the ground shook. "You already know how to work," he said. Cordelia stepped closer. "Then teach me how to defend it." For a long moment he said nothing. The only sound was the fire and the wind fingering the porch rails outside. Then Jeremiah pushed the shotgun toward her like he'd been waiting for her to ask. "Hold it." Cordelia picked it up and immediately felt the honest weight of it drag at her arms. Her shoulders tensed. The barrel dipped, then rose, then dipped again. Damn it, she muttered, low. Jeremiah's voice stayed even. Don't fight the weight. Let it settle. He stepped behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through wool and air, then guided her hands to the grip and forend. His palms were rough. His touch wasn't tender, but it wasn't grabbing either. It was practical, like he was teaching someone to split wood without taking off their own foot. He nudged her boot into position. Lean into it, he said, or it'll lean into you. Cordelia tried again. This time the barrel steadied, the motion slowing until it stopped wandering. Jeremiah gave one short nod. Better. A laugh almost escaped her, short and surprised, because she couldn't remember the last time someone had assumed she could learn something hard. In Boston, she said, the only thing anyone taught me was how to take up less space. Jeremiah's hands paused, just for a breath. Then they taught you wrong, he said. They spent the morning making the cabin meaner. Jeremiah showed her the narrow slits cut into the shutters, small, hidden, placed like a man who planned ahead. Cordelia ran her fingers over the edges and understood he'd built this place to survive more than weather. He pointed out where the logs overlapped in a way that stopped a bullet, and where they didn't. He showed her the root cellar under the trapdoor and said, if fire comes, you go there. Cordelia felt her spine stiffen. And you? Jeremiah's mouth twitched, the closest thing to humor she'd seen from him in days. I don't fit in cellars. By midday, the sky had clouded, not with rain, but with that bruised look mountains get when the wind changes its mind. Cordelia carried water and stacked extra wood near the hearth. She kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see riders between trunks, or worse, something else. The night before had left its mark on her nerves. That sound, like laughter tangled in sobbing, kept replaying in her head as if the mountain had planted it there. She finally asked what she'd been circling around since dawn. About the sound, she said, careful not to let fear shake her voice. Is it an owl? Jeremiah stared out the window as if the pines might answer for him. No. Cordelia waited. She was learning that Jeremiah's silence wasn't always refusal. It was sometimes the price of telling the truth. After a moment, he said, the Ute call places like that thin. He nodded toward a higher line of rock where the trees grew sparse and the wind ran hard. Where bad thoughts don't stay inside men, they leak out. Cordelia's throat tightened. A spirit? Jeremiah shrugged. Small movement for such a big man. Or grief that doesn't know where to go. That answer landed heavy. Not because it was frightening, but because it felt personal. Like it belonged to him. Later that afternoon, he led her up toward the ridge. Not fast, not marching. Just walking like he needed open air around his thoughts. The climb wasn't as steep as the earlier trail, but the wind up there cut sharper, tugging at Cordelia's hairpins and making her eyes water. They reached a cairn of stone stacked with care. A crude cross stood beside it, weathered gray. The kind of wood that's been scoured by winter until it looks tired. Cordelia stopped so suddenly she felt her pulse in her throat. Jeremiah didn't look at her. He looked at the stones. Mary, he said. Then, after a pause that seemed to cost him, Thomas. Cordelia's chest tightened. She didn't step closer. She didn't touch. She just stood beside him and let the wind carry their silence like it carried everything else. After a long time, she asked softly, how? Jeremiah kept staring at the cairn as if it might argue back. Winter, he said. A fall. A sickness after. His jaw worked like he was chewing bone. And me, not getting there fast enough. Cordelia swallowed hard. She wanted to say she was sorry, but the words felt thin up here. Sorry didn't lift stones. Sorry didn't stop snow. She just stayed. Jeremiah's gaze shifted beyond the cairn to a jagged cut in the rock, farther up the slope. After, he said, I found the vein. Cordelia followed his look. She didn't need him to explain which vein. The mountain's secret. The thing that made men like Weatherby and Rusk salivate. You think it's cursed, she said quietly. Jeremiah's shoulders rose and fell once. I don't know what I think, he admitted. Men come for reasons. Grief makes its own reasons. I didn't want to hand Weatherby a story he could use. They walked back down as the light began to fade. And that's when Cordelia saw the tracks near the creek. Not deer, not bear, not boot prints either. The marks were long and narrow, with a strange drag line between steps, as if whatever made them pulled something behind it. Cordelia stopped, staring. Is that from last night? Jeremiah crouched, touched the edge of one print, then stood. No. How do you know? Jeremiah's eyes lifted to the pines. Because last night it stayed on the roof. Cold rushed down Cordelia's spine. She tried to shape the fear into something smaller. Branches, animals, wind tricks, but it didn't shrink. They returned to the cabin and moved through supper like people pretending normal is a door they can shut. Cordelia cooked, Jeremiah ate. Outside, the wind kept testing the shutters. After the dishes were done, Jeremiah reached for the violin case. Cordelia watched, surprised. It felt strange, almost wrong, to bring music into a room being prepared for violence. Like lighting a candle in a gun barrel. Jeremiah opened the case and lifted the violin with careful hands. The way he held him made him look less like a legend, and more like a man with something breakable inside him. He drew the bow across the strings. The first note was low and aching. It filled the cabin the way smoke fills a hollow. Slow, inevitable, touching every corner. The melody came like a memory that hurt to carry. I didn't know the tune, but I understood it anyway. It sounded like love that had nowhere to go. When the last note faded, Jeremiah set the violin down gently. Mary liked that one, he said. Cordelia's voice came quiet. I'm sorry. Jeremiah nodded once. Don't be, he said. Sorry doesn't carry wood. Cordelia almost smiled, because it was rough and practical, and oddly kind in its own way. Then the cabin went still again, and that's when the knocking came. 3 slow taps. Not from the door. From the side of the cabin, near the corner where shadows pulled thickest. Cordelia froze so hard she felt it in her teeth. Jeremiah's hand moved to the rifle as if it had never left. His eyes stayed on the dark window, and his posture didn't change much. But Cordelia could feel the room tighten around them, like the cabin itself had drawn in a breath. Another knocking followed, softer, deliberate, almost polite. Cordelia whispered, "What is it?" Jeremiah didn't look away from the window. "Whatever it is," he said, voice low as gravel. It learned manners. The knocking stopped. A pause stretched out. Fire crackling, wind wheeze outside. Then the sound rose again from the trees. That thin, wavering cry, half laugh and half sob, sliding through the pines like cold fingers. Cordelia felt her skin pebble. Jeremiah spoke quietly, not to frighten her, but to anchor her. "Stay close to the cellar door tonight." Cordelia tightened her grip on the shotgun. She didn't ask again what the sound was. She just listened as Thunder Peak spoke in its strange language outside, and the cabin waited in the circle of firelight. 2 people inside it, not quite safe, not quite alone, and not running anymore. They showed up the next afternoon, just when the light starts to get sharp, and the wind feels like it's testing your nerves on purpose. Cordelia saw them first from upstairs, through the glass that still held the cold from the night. Down in the trees, where the meadow breaks into pine shadow, a line of dark shapes moved where no lines should have been. Horses picking careful steps, men sitting stiff in their saddles, like they believed righteousness could keep them warm. She counted without meaning to. 7. Then she caught the last one riding behind the rest, and her stomach tightened. 8. Jeremiah came up beside her, silent as ever, and looked out like he'd been expecting the sight all morning. "How many?" he asked. 8, Cordelia said. Her voice stayed steady, but her fingers didn't. Jeremiah's face didn't change much, but his eyes did, hardening, narrowing, turning into that storm-gray focus that made the whole room feel smaller. "Weatherby won't climb himself unless he has to," he muttered. "He'll send other men to sweat for him." Cordelia swallowed and tasted the old fear again, the fear of papers, of being claimed by ink. But something in her refused to fold this time, not after the room upstairs, not after the comb on her nightstand, not after being treated like a person for the first time in years. Jeremiah didn't waste time on speeches. He moved like a man packing for a storm. He barred the door, not because he thought a bar could stop a determined mob, but because a second matters when men are coming with rifles. He checked the shutters, and Cordelia watched him slide his hand over old cuts in the wood, narrow slits she hadn't noticed until he'd shown her. The cabin had been built with weather in mind, but Jeremiah had thought about people too. He handed her a pouch of shells, and his voice was calm in that way that made calm feel heavier than shouting. "Don't waste," he said. "Aim small." Cordelia noted. Her hands shook once, then she forced them still. Outside, the riders broke from the trees into the meadow like a stain spreading across clean snow. At the front rode the deputy with the 2 bright star. Behind him, Weatherby sat high and uncomfortable, gripping his saddle like he didn't trust the mountain not to throw him off. And behind Weatherby rode Rusk, the man Caleb had named, the man with the flat brim hat and the eyes like a nail driven into wood. They stopped just out of rifle range because men who like law also like an audience. Weatherby cupped his hands. "Mr. Stone, we're here under lawful authority." Jeremiah stepped onto the porch where they could see him clearly. He held his rifle loose, not waving it, not hiding it either. He stood like the cabin itself had grown a spine. "You climbed a long way for paper," Jeremiah called back. The deputy lifted a rolled document like it was a weapon all its own. "This here is a writ," he shouted. "Cordelia Murphy is under contract with Weatherby's company. She's to be returned to town until the matter's settled, by force if necessary." Inside the doorway, Cordelia stood in shadow, the shotgun held tight across her body. Hearing her name read out like a label made something hot twist in her gut. She wasn't a crate, she wasn't a mistake, she wasn't leverage. Weatherby's voice slid in, sweet as rot. "Cordelia, dear, this doesn't have to be unpleasant. You've been misled. Come down and we'll sort it out properly." Jeremiah didn't move. "You'll sort out nothing on my porch." Rusk spoke then, and his voice carried clean through the cold air, dry and sure. "We're not here to argue, Stone. We're here to remove an asset and secure a claim. Cordelia felt her teeth clench at that word, asset, like he was talking about a mule or a pickaxe. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. Claim to what? Rusk didn't blink. Land you never registered, minerals you never declared. There it was, the real hunger, the real reason the mountains suddenly had visitors. Jeremiah's answer was simple. No. The deputy spat into the grass and lifted his rifle. Then we'll do it the hard way. Jeremiah didn't fire first. That detail mattered to Cordelia, even then. He could have taken the deputy off his horse with one shot and ended the talking, but he didn't. Maybe because he understood what killing does to a man afterward. Maybe because he buried enough. The first shot came from the riders anyway. Someone jumpy, someone eager, someone trying to prove himself. The bullet slapped into the porch post and threw splinters like angry bees. Jeremiah moved in the same breath. He slipped from porch to shutter slits, shouldering his rifle with practiced calm. He fired once, measured, not wild, and outside a rider cried out and a horse screamed, rearing hard. Suddenly the meadow was full of noise. Gunfire crocking, horses snorting and step-stepping, smoke curling low over snow patches, men shouting orders over each other, like volume could replace courage. Inside, Cordelia dropped to her knees at the window slit Jeremiah had shown her. She could see the deputy now, face flushed, star flashing as he waved his men forward. Her arms trembled. She remembered Jeremiah's lesson. Don't fight the weight, let it settle. Lean into it, or it'll lean into you. She raised the shotgun, aimed, fired. The blast tore lead the earth near the deputy's horse, spraying dirt and snow. The horse spooked sideways, jerking the deputy off balance. It wasn't a clean hit, but it was enough to make them respect the windows. Cordelia's heart slammed once hard. She hadn't known she could do that, stand her ground with her own hands, not borrowed bravery. Jeremiah glanced back at her, smoke drifting between them, and something fierce sparked in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or recognition. Again, he said, not in kind. Make them respect the windows. Cordelia loaded shells with shaking fingers, each click sounding like a decision. Outside, Weatherby ducked behind a boulder and hollered, "Don't damage the cabin. That cabin is property." Cordelia wanted to laugh and couldn't. Even now, with bullets flying, Weatherby worried about wood and value. Then she saw movement on the flank. 2 men slipping wider through the trees. Careful, smart. Jeremiah saw it too. "They're going around," Cordelia warned. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "Stay here." "No," Cordelia answered immediately. The word surprised her with how clean it ended out. Jeremiah looked at her then, really looked, and for a heartbeat the gunfire outside felt far away. His eyes searched her face like he was asking a question without words. Cordelia answered by lifting the shotgun a little higher. She wasn't hiding. Not anymore. Jeremiah gave one sharp nod. "Then move when I move." He yanked open the trapdoor to the root cellar and shoved a bucket toward her. "If they throw fire, you drown it. If you see torches, you don't hesitate." Cordelia gripped the bucket handle, knuckles whitening. Outside, one of the flanking men produced a bottle wrapped in cloth. Kerosene. Fire. Cordelia's stomach dropped. The cabin had endured storms, but fire didn't care about craftsmanship. Jeremiah raised his rifle to stop them. And then the wind shifted. Hard. Sudden. The pines along the cabin's edge shuddered as if something large had moved through them. And that thin, wavering sound rose again. Half sob, half laughter. Closer this time. Sharp enough to hit Cordelia's skin pebble. The flanking men froze. One turned his head toward the trees like he'd been slapped. "What in God's?" he began. Something moved in the shadow between trunks. Too tall. Too narrow. Swaying wrong. Like it didn't know the rules of bones. Cordelia's breath caught. She tried to make it into something ordinary. A bear. A man. A trick of light. But her mind refused to lie. Jeremiah didn't look at it. Not even once. He kept his rifle trained on the men with the bottle. Voice low and hard. "Now," he said to Cordelia. "While they're stupid." Cordelia surged forward and threw the bucket of water through the shutter gap. The arc splashed across the sidewall and soaked the kerosene cloth in the man's hands. He cursed and dropped the bottle, wet rags sagging uselessly. Jeremiah fired a warning shot, then punched Rod close enough to make the flankers stumble back pale, suddenly remembering he was mortal. The deputy shouted, "Ignore it. It's a trick." But men don't ignore the woods when the woods start sounding like grief with teeth. Rusk didn't spook like the others. He watched the tree line with a cold, measuring look, like he'd expected the mountain to have its own ways of saying no. Then he lifted his rifle and aimed not at Jeremiah, but straight at her. rifle found the broken window like it had been built for it. Through the smoke and the glitter of shattered glass, Cordelia saw the black mouth of the barrel settle on her, steady as a judgment. Time did that cruel, slow-stretching thing, showing her too many details at once. The deputy's hat lying in the grass, Weatherby's horse sidestepping like it wanted no part of this, the way Jeremiah's knuckles tightened around his rifle stock. Jeremiah moved before she could even inhale. He didn't shout her name. He didn't waste breath on warning. He crossed the room in 2 heavy strides, hooked one arm around her middle, and yanked her down behind the table so hard her cheek kissed the floorboards. The shot cracked a heartbeat later. It sounded different inside, louder, meaner, like the cabin itself had been slapped. Splinters burst from the wall where Cordelia's head had been, and the air filled with burnt powder and crushed pine. Cordelia lay there, heart hammering, tasting dust. Jeremiah's mouth was close to her ear. "Stay low," he breathed, calm in the way a storm can be calm right before it breaks. Cordelia hissed back something that wasn't quite a joke, more like a promise to herself that she was still present. Jeremiah rose into a crouch and fired through the shutter slit, 2 measured shots, not wasted. Outside, someone yelled and a horse screamed. Weatherby's voice rose into a frantic squeal about property, as if the cabin's value mattered more than the people inside it. Then Cordelia smelled it, sharp and oily, cutting through gunsmoke, kerosene. Her stomach dropped. Fire was the one enemy logs respected. She crawled, trying to reach the trapdoor in the bucket Jeremiah had shoved toward her earlier, and her mind kept flashing images of flame climbing the walls, of smoke filling the staircase, of that upstairs room with the quilt and pine boughs turning into a furnace. Jeremiah saw it too. He swore once, low, vicious, and his eyes snapped toward the back of the room. Past the hearth and the shelves of books, past the table where the violin case had sat, to a tall cabinet tucked against the wall. He moved like the decision had been made years ago. He grabbed the cabinet and shoved it aside with a heavy scrape that sent dust puffing up from the floor. Behind it was an opening, narrow, dark, cut into the timber like a secret meant for winters and worse. Cordelia stared at it, stunned. "You hadn't escaped the whole time?" she breathed. Jeremiah didn't look at her. "I had winters," he answered, like that explained everything. Outside, something shattered against the logs, another bottle, another wet slap of fuel. A muffled whoosh followed, and orange light flickered across the window frame. Jeremiah thrust a canvas pack into Cordelia's arms. It dragged her shoulders down with its weight. "Food, matches, blanket," he said. She clutched it, eyes darting. Jeremiah snapped the violin case off the table, hesitated, just a breath, then put it back on the shelf as if cutting a thread he couldn't afford to hold. It wasn't romance, it was triage. He guided her into the passage. Cordelia went first, half crawling, pack scraping her back, the tunnel smelling of sap and earth. Jeremiah followed, impossibly quiet for a man his size, and above them the cabin groaned with impacts and heat. The fire sound was hungry even through timber, fast crackle, eager breath. Cordelia's throat tightened. "You're home?" she started. "If it burns, I'll build again," Jeremiah said, flat but not empty. They emerged behind a stand of fir trees downslope, into cold air and the sharp scent of resin. Smoke curled up through the pines, gunshots cracked overhead. Bullets clipped bark nearby, snapping splinters into the air like angry insects. Jeremiah didn't run straight. He moved them in angles, pulling Cordelia behind trunks and rocks, using the land like a shield. Each yank and pause obeyed the mountain's physics: weight, inertia, breath. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Cordelia stumbled once and caught herself, pack tugging her backward like a stubborn child. She forced her legs to keep moving. Through a gap in the trees, she saw the cabin burning. The porch railing glowed and then fell in crooked pieces. Weatherby's men had creeped closer, emboldened by flame. Rusk moved among them with that same calm, like the fire was just a tool. Jeremiah's jaw worked hard as he watched it. "They think they've got us penned," he murmured. Cordelia's voice came tight. "Don't they?" Jeremiah's gaze lifted to the ridgeline where the trees thinned and the wind ran hard. "No," he said. "This mountain has more doors than they know." And then the thin sound rose again from the woods, closer now, sharper, sliding between sobbing and laughter like something wearing a human voice as a mask. Cordelia's skin prickled. She turned her head, eyes straining into shadow, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw something tall and narrow shift behind a trunk. Not a bear, not a man. Something that swayed like it didn't trust its own bones. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the sound and the wind and the way Cordelia's heart tried to climb out of her chest. "Jeremiah, what is that?" He didn't answer her question. He asked his own, quiet and dangerous. "Can you climb?" Cordelia stared uphill. The ridge looked like teeth. "I climbed to get here," she said, breath catching in the thin air. "That wasn't climbing," Jeremiah replied. "That was walking with hope. This is different." For one strange second, Cordelia almost laughed, because Jeremiah Stone of all men had just said something that sounded like a preacher. But the humor didn't stick. Below them, the cabin popped and cracked as another beam surrendered to flame. Smoke thickened. The world narrowed to choices. Cordelia set her jaw. "Yes, I can climb." Jeremiah stepped close and tightened her pack straps himself, tugging them so the weight sat right.
practical, intimate only by necessity. Then we go to the thin place, he said. Cordelia swallowed. The ridge? Higher, Jeremiah answered. Behind them, the burning cabin gave a loud wooden crack, and the sound traveled through the meadow like a final warning. Jeremiah's hand landed on Cordelia's shoulder. One firm squeeze, not comfort exactly, but grounding. Then he turned and started uphill, and Cordelia followed, boots biting into loose scree, breath steaming in the cold shade of pines. They climbed into thicker timber, then into sparser growth, where wind cut sharper and the air tasted like stone. The strange cry threaded through the trees again, then faded, then returned. Never quite close enough to see its source, always close enough to feel watched. And below, somewhere near the meadow, men shouted and horses snorted, and the law tried to pretend it owned the mountain. But up on that slope, Cordelia felt something shift inside her. The same body that had been mocked in Dry Gulch was now hauling her up a ridge that would break delicate people. Her hands, once only good for cooking and carrying, now held a shotgun with purpose. Her fear hadn't vanished. It had simply stopped being the loudest voice. Jeremiah didn't look back. He didn't waste time mourning the cabin while it was still burning. He climbed like the only prayer he trusted was motion. And Cordelia climbed with him. Into wind, into shadow, into the thin place where the mountain's old wounds sang.
Down in Dry Gulch, I tried to do what Jeremiah Stone told me to do. Keep quiet, keep my head down, pretend I hadn't climbed half a mountain with bad news burning a hole in my pocket. But the next day, I watched Weatherby and his men ride out with extra rifles and extra kerosene, like they were going to a picnic and not a fight. Folks in town pretended not to notice. That's a talent Dry Gulch has. Acting blind when seeing might cost you something. Then, by sundown, I saw it. A bruise of smoke smeared across the far sky above the tree line. Not a campfire, not a chimney, something bigger, something wrong. I stood outside the feed store with my hands jammed in my pockets so nobody could see them shaking. I told myself Jeremiah Stone was big enough to handle it. I told myself Cordelia Murphy wasn't my problem. But the truth is, Cordelia had looked at me like I was a person when she poured me coffee. Like I mattered more than a boy-shaped tool for errands. And people don't hand out that look very often in Dry Gulch. So I saddled my mother's mule. Her name was Mercy. She did not live up to it. She bit my sleeve when I tightened the cinch, then walked sideways for half a mile like she was protesting the very idea of cooperation. I leaned close to her ear and whispered, "If you get me killed, I'll haunt you." Mercy flicked an ear like she'd heard better threats. I rode the lower trail at night, because daylight would have meant questions, and questions in Dry Gulch tend to grow teeth. The sky was hard with stars. The wind smelled like sage at first, then pine, then old snow. Every so often that thin, wavering sound drifted down through the trees, half laugh, half sob, like the mountain was trying to speak in a language that didn't belong to people. Mercy didn't like it. She'd pause, ears pinned, then lurch forward again with a grumpy snort, like she was blaming me for the existence of ghosts. By dawn, my legs ached and my throat tasted like dust and fear, and then I reached the high meadow. The cabin was still there, sort of. One side was blackened. The poor trail had burned through and fallen in crooked pieces. Smoke rose from the roofline in slow, wounded breaths. The smell hit me hard, charred pine and wet ash, and something else that made my eyes sting the way onions do when you don't want to cry. I slid off Mercy and ran forward before my brain could remind me to be careful. "Cordelia!" I shouted, then slapped my own mouth like the sound might bring every gunman on the mountain down on my head. Now answer. Just the faint crackle of embers still worrying at what remained. I stood there a moment, staring at the burned bones of the place, and my stomach turned. The yard was churned up with boot tracks. Horses had cut the grass into mud. I saw dark spots near a stump, blood, and a dragged line leading toward the trees. My hands went cold. I wanted to run. I wanted to pretend I'd never seen any of it. But I had already climbed here. Pretending felt like a luxury for people who hadn't made choices yet. So I followed the drag mark into the timber. I hadn't gone far when Mercy brayed, loud, offended, echoing through the pines like an announcement. I froze. Then I heard voices uphill. Men. I ducked behind a boulder and peered through branches. 3 of Weatherby's hired riders moved through the trees below the cabin, rifles in hand, eyes scanning. They looked tired and angry, men who'd expected an easy job and got a hard one. One spot and said something about Stone having rabbit holes. Another complained about the deputy being clipped. The third, young, pale, kept glancing toward the ridge like he didn't trust the woods to stay quiet. "And what about that sound?" the youngest muttered. The first one laughed, but it wasn't real laughter. "Sounds wind," he said, "or your mother calling you home." "It ain't wind," the youngest insisted. "It sounds like somebody crying." The second man's eyes slid to the dark trees. "This mountain's full of women's ghosts if you listen long enough." They laughed again, nervous laughter, the kind men used to hammer courage back into place. I was outnumbered and outgunned, and the mule had already betrayed me once. I couldn't fight them, but I could do something else.
I reached into my satchel and pulled out a little tin of lamp oil. Stolen, yes. But right then I wasn't thinking about theft. I was thinking about seconds, about sound, about direction. I crept around behind the boulder, poured a thin ribbon of oil along a deadfall, and struck a match with fingers that didn't want to behave. The flame jumped, bright and small. I whispered sorry to whatever tree I was about to offend, and touched the match to the oil. Fire ran low and quick along the deadwood, not a roaring blaze, just enough to spit smoke. Then I picked up a stone and hurled it into brush downhill. Crash. All 3 riders snapped their heads toward the sound. What's that? The youngest demanded. Go, the first snapped. Check it. They moved downhill toward the noise, exactly the way I prayed they would. Then Mercy brayed again, longer and louder, like she was proud of her contribution to my death. Traitor, I hissed at her through my teeth. But the men were already going the other way, focused on the crash and the curl of smoke. I didn't wait to see if my little trick held. I grabbed Mercy's reins and hauled her uphill. She resisted like a mule does, like stubbornness is a religion, but she moved. Hooves scraped rock, my arms burned. Higher up, the air got colder, the pines got tighter, the wind cut sharper. And then I saw it. A narrow break in the rock that led into a hollow where the wind did strange things, where it tunneled through old holes and made that awful wavering moan. The sound that had haunted my whole climb wasn't coming from a spirit. It was coming from the mountain itself, from emptiness and old timber and air shoved through a tight throat. The relief hit me first, fast, sharp, almost dizzying. Then fear followed right behind it, because wind might explain the sound, but it didn't explain the smoke, or the blood, or the drag mark. In the hollow sat an old mine opening, timbers rotted, rails half buried, the mouth of it black as a throat. I stepped closer and saw fresh tracks in the dirt, a heavy boot print and a lighter step beside it. Jeremiah and Cordelia. There was a drag mark, too, leading inward. My mouth went dry. I edged forward and called softly, Mr. Stone? For a moment, nothing answered. Then from inside the dark, a voice came, quiet and rough. Boy. Jeremiah Stone stepped into the mine mouth like he'd been carved from its darkness. His shirt was torn at the shoulder and smeared with soot. A thin line of blood ran down his forearm, already drying. His eyes were hard, but he was standing, alive. Behind him, Cordelia appeared, face smudged with ash, hair half loose. She held the shotgun with both hands, barrel steady. She didn't look like anyone's property. She looked like someone who'd learned a new shape for herself. My knees nearly gave out from relief. I saw smoke, I blurted. I came. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. I told you not to. I know, I said, voice cracking. But nobody listens to you down there. I figured someone ought to. Cordelia's mouth twitched, almost a smile. He's got a point. Jeremiah looked at her, then back at me, and something like resignation crossed his face, mixed with a sliver of respect he didn't seem comfortable wearing. You're lucky you're alive, he said. I glanced toward the trees downhill. Are they? Close, Jeremiah cut in. Rosk will follow tracks like a bloodhound. Cordelia's gaze shifted toward the mine entrance, where the wind kept moaning through the tunnel like grief that refused to sleep. This place, she said quietly. This is what you meant by thin. Jeremiah nodded once. Wind talks through old holes. I hugged myself, suddenly aware of how cold the hollow felt. It sounds like it's laughing. It isn't, Jeremiah said. It's warning.